me one moment. Okay. Perek Gimel Megillat Esther, and where we're starting from is immediately after the episode of Bigtan and Teresh, of the possible coup that had been planned and was foiled by Mordechai. And so the Megillah picks up immediately with the words Achar hadvarim ha'eleh, that after these things. Now, after these things begs the question of what are we talking about? What were these things? And so Rashi immediately says, based on a medrash, that after HaKadosh Baruch Hu has already created the cure, barata refuah, after he has created the cure for what is going to happen, now we're ready to get into the bad stuff. So after Mordechai's name was already recorded in the annals of Achashverosh, and after he would be able to be rewarded at some point in the future, then along comes Haman. However, Rabbi Yoshua Bachrach, and Shoshi had him as a teacher, we've confirmed that the Michlala, who wrote a series of beautiful books combining Medrash with the text, and in this was Kitvuni L'Dorot, was the sefer he wrote. And in his book, Kitvuni L'Dorot, it used to be published by Feldheim. Unfortunately, it's out of print for many years, but it's still available sometimes on eBay. You can still find it sometimes. But in his book, Kitvuni L'Dorot, he suggests something very, very different. And he says that after these things, referring to Bigtan and Teresh, the immediate previous story that we had dealt with, Achashverosh realized that his life was in danger. And what Achashverosh chose to do was seclude himself in his palace. He didn't want to go out of his palace. He needed to put somebody else who would be the front man because he was afraid that he'd get killed. And so Achar hadvarim ha'eleh was after Bigtan and Teresh. Along comes Achashverosh and says, I need somebody. And who's that somebody going to be? Well, he's going to be picking Haman for this purpose. The Ibn Ezra says Achar hadvarim ha'eleh just as a chronological piece, okay, because we skip another 5 years in the story. The appointment of Esther had been in Perek Zion, and so now 5 years go on, fine. But after all of this was necessary, Rav Bachrach's piece is beautiful, his idea. Gidal hamelech Achashverosh et Haman ben Hamdata Agagi, vayinas ehu, and he lifted him up. So he made him great. Gidal is an interesting word because we do have vayinas ehu immediately afterwards, which is also to lift up. So why do you have both Gidal and Vayinasehu? Says the Ibn Ezra, and the second version of the Ibn Ezra that we have on this, but Gidal doesn't refer to promote, but it literally means that he elevated him by granting him all sorts of riches. He gave him a lot of things that raised him up in the eyes of others. That's the Gidal. And when he says Haman ben Hamdata Agagi, well, immediately you hear the name Agagi, and Yoni Grossman in his commentary talks about, well, that's clear that what the Megillah wants to do is immediately create this association, because Agag is a name that you just can't forget. He was such a horrific enemy of ours, Agag being the king once of Amalek. Now, Lahavdil, I don't know if it's Lahavdil, it's probably analogous to what we would have nowadays if you go ahead and you say so-and-so, so-and-so, the Nazi, or the Hitlerite, or something of that nature. You hear that name, and immediately you know what it means. And so Grossman says that's immediately what we're trying to do. We're trying to create that association of danger. Here is the ultimate of an enemy of the Jewish people, Ha'agagi. The problem is, within this phrase, it doesn't say Gidal Hamelech Achashverosh et Haman ben Hamdata Ha'amaleki. It doesn't say that he's really Amalek. It just says Agagi. Agag was the name of the king of Amalek at the time of King Saul. If you remember, one of the three things that Saul didn't do that ultimately led to Shmuel telling him that the monarchy was being taken away was he didn't follow the directions and kill all of Amalek. Instead, he killed all of Amalek except for the king, and he brought back all of the cattle and everything else and the king, because there was this sense of honor among kings. Even if he's your enemy, you don't kill a king. You may cut off his fingers and his toes and everything else, but you don't kill him. You keep him alive. Okay. Now, in that sense, we hear Agag and we assume immediately Amalek, but it doesn't say Amalek, which is the reason there are some who suggest, and this is noted in Dat Mikra, one of the footnotes, that Agagi was not, that he wasn't from Amalek, but instead he was from a tribe. There was a Persian tribe at the time. We would call them the Magites. They were a different, we have the same word, the Magi. We have that same word which we're familiar with. Okay, he was from a tribe that was known as Agag, but wasn't necessarily Amalek. And the reason behind that thinking is because if he was Amalek, say it. If you don't say it, then maybe there's a reason why you don't say it. Maybe it is that he wasn't that person. Now, that would also make some element of sense because we know that according to the Nach, back in Shmuel Aleph, Shaul killed all of Amalek with the exclusion of Agag. Agag he kept alive, and then as soon as Shmuel came, Shmuel killed Agag. Or Shmuel said, "You didn't do the job. I'm going to do the job," and he killed him, which would suggest that he doesn't have any descendants. And so all of that kind of fits into this piece, but there's a medrash. And the midrashim, not just a single medrash, there's a number of midrashim, and in fact, the Targum Sheni, the secondary translation and commentary that's found in Aramaic, the Targum Sheni we talked about last week, I believe. In the Targum Sheni, it actually gives all of Haman's yichus going all the way back to Esav and Yishmael. So back to Esav and to Yishmael. So it ties this Haman to the real Amalek. And we have that whole yichus, and that's part of the midrashic tradition. And based on that, the only way you could explain how Haman could be a direct descendant of Agag is, as the Medrash explains, that one night when he was imprisoned by Shaul, before he was killed by Shmuel, he had relations with someone, according to the Targum. The one he had relations with, was his wife Hamdata, and his wife Hamdata had a child, and according to the Targum Sheni, the child's name was Vaizata, that he ultimately named one of his own kids after one of his ancestors. These are really handy names. And now I understand how Agag could be, this Haman could be the real descendant of Agag. Now, it isn't even that complicated, though. You don't have to go that far as you do with the Medrash, because we see in Shmuel Aleph Perek Lamed that David encounters people from Amalek, and then you see in Divrei Yomim Aleph, the Chizkiyahu, goes ahead, and the Bnei Shimon in the time of Chizkiyahu, that they kill off Amalek, which means, just to give you the history, if we say all of Shaul had killed all of Amalek, then how in the next king, David, were there still some people to be killed? And if we say David killed all of Amalek, then how was it in generations down, Chizkiyahu HaMelech, that there was someone to kill? So apparently, even according to the Pshat of the Navi, there were descendants of Amalek who survived Shaul's massacre of their people. And in that sense, this Haman could have been clearly from Amalek without any kind of midrashic acrobatics involved. So the simplest thing to say is Haman ben Hamdata Agagi. Now it goes back to also, remember, we have this tradition, and this goes back, in fact, to Reb Chaim Brisker. So that's Rav Soloveitchik's grandfather. Would say there was a famous question about whether or not Amalek exists nowadays. And he felt Amalek still exists nowadays, even though Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed tribal identities by population exchange. He felt that they still existed nowadays. But the way you could prove if they existed is how they behaved. If there was a person who behaved like Amalek, that was an indication that they were Amalek. That's why people would say the Nazis were Amalek. But I could also say at the very same time that what we're seeing from all of this, Haman sounds like the prototypical Amaleki. He wants to kill the Jews. He wants to kill him. He does everything he can to kill him. And so it makes sense to say, hey, he is, and the Medrash says he is connected, and there's a possibility of how he could be connected. But we're still left with this one big question mark. Why doesn't it say it explicitly in the Megillah?
Did he know so much about them that he wanted to kill them before Mordecai came along? So
did he know so much about them? The question is, did Haman know so much about the Jews that he hated them? Well, we have this great tradition of Haman being where do you keep the horses? And the stable boy, okay, and that he had the encounters with Mordecai before, okay. But if I say he's from Amalek, well, Amalek is a nation that hates us from the beginning, and there was a tradition, and that tradition was passed on person by person, just like we have a tradition, a mitzvah, to destroy Amalek. They probably had, their concepts of destroying the Jews. Okay, yeah. So just to go back, we finished almost the first pasuk. Gidal hamelech Achashverosh et Haman ben Hamdata Agagi. Achashverosh elevated in a way that he made him important by granting him, wealth and riches, and he did Vayanas Eu, and then he promoted him. Vayasem et kiso me'al kol hasarim asherito, and he lifted his chair higher than any other chair around. So for those of us of a certain age, if you recall the musical The King and I. Okay, now let's see how many of you remember The King and I. There's a scene in The King and I where the king of Siam, and I'm not remembering the characters' names. What was the name of the woman who was the teacher? Somebody gonna help me? Deborah Carr, yeah, whatever. That she was that the king was making the point that she could never be seated at the same level. She always had to be lower. The king always had to be at the higher seat. I don't know if you remember the scene. I don't remember what song went along with it. Leah Cohn is Anna. Thank you, Leah Cohn. Anna was the teacher, and Anna had to be always lower because whoever's sitting higher was more significant. Now, in Jewish tradition, we have the idea of seated is also an element of kavod. The only one who could sit in the Beit HaMikdash was the king. Okay, at the times of when the Gemara was being taught, and in the times of the Tanaim and Amoraim, who was seated made a very big difference of what the roles were. But we also find this, and this is really an interesting connection that Professor Yonatan Grossman makes as well with an earlier piece we had learned. If you remember, we said that Mordecai was either a descendant or an actual exile from the time of King Yechoniah. When Yechoniah was exiled, the first of the three exiles of Nebuchadnezzar before the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, 17, 18 years before that, he had exiled the king. And then at the very end of Sefer Melachim Bet, we say that the king Nebuchadnezzar placed, actually it was the king Avil Merodach, Natanet Kiso, Gavoa Me'al Kisei Amlachim Asherito. He promoted Yechoniah to a position of honor in exile. We see this idea of lifting his chair up high. Grossman suggests that by having this lifting Haman's chair up high may be one of the ways that the author of the Megillah wants to remind us that we as a people made a terrible and a tragic mistake, because the vast majority of our people stayed in exile instead of going back to Eretz Yisrael when they had a chance to do so. And as a result, when we had the chair lifted, okay, we felt comfortable, and we felt at this point that we've made it and we're comfortable in the exile. Well, you know what? Let's show you who else's chair gets lifted now. And Haman's chair gets lifted as well, because it's using, again, the same kind of language which you had with Yechoniah with Haman. Yeah, Yafa.
I have a problem with that, only because, can you hear me?
I hear you fine. I'm making it louder. Yeah.
Okay. The reason I have a problem with that is I am aware that there was a question posed to Yechezkel Hanavi. What should we do when we are here in Babel in Gullus? Should we just give up everything? And he had a letter from Yirmiyahu, I believe, Benu Batim. No, you guys need to settle yourselves in the land where you are. And so therefore there was not this issue of coming back at the time of at least Yechanyahu, and certainly some years afterwards.
No, so you're right in terms of Yechoniah that he is not held to blame. Okay, but the generations after, by the time we get to the story of the Megillah, especially if we say that this happens already after the time when Ezra and Nehemiah have returned to build the Beit HaMikdash, it's definitely after the time of Cyrus in the first decree. Okay, that these people who now were living in Shushan had an opportunity or have an opportunity at any point to go back, they chose not to. And that's I think his point. Not that we're not placing any blame on the king who was elevated when he was basically a slave of Nebuchadnezzar or of Avil Merodach at that time. So we see this next step. Yeah, Barry.
Are you saying that this took place after Cyrus's decree?
This took place. So here's the question. Remember, depending on the chronology that we use, the chronology of Seder Olam Rabbah, which is the classic chronology of Chazal, places this between the two temples. However, the chronology of historians, which adds another 167 years, 168 years, places this afterwards. That was that whole question of how many kings were there in Persia and how long was the Persian era.
Where does Ezra and Nehemiah stand here?
As well, either before or after. Either before or after. Yeah. Now we do know that, let me go back one step. Cyrus, I'm going to correct myself. The order of the kings, even according to Chazal, here is Cyrus, and after Cyrus comes Achashverosh. Cyrus was the end of the 70 years. He gave the command that they can go back. Then he canceled that decree. There's a debate on why he canceled the decree. Okay, but he canceled the decree. So there had been an opportunity. It was after the 70 years. Was it before or after Ezra Nehemiah is the question that we deal with. Okay. There was a chance for them to go back, right? If I take it into modern times, this is not a real good analogy. Okay, we are living in exile. We have opportunities to go back, right? It was a different kind of choice when a person had an opportunity to go to Israel, let's say in the 50s and early 60s. In the 50s, when there was tremendous poverty and it was difficult. It was a very difficult life. That might be if I say that the Megillah was earlier in times that it would have been very hard to go back there to Israel. Later times might be more analogous to nowadays, where even though United has canceled their direct flight for the meantime from Chicago, it's still not that hard to get back to Israel if we wanted to get back to Israel. Okay. Let's move on. Yes. Now, to go back, I want to get all the way to Pasuk Bet. Okay, because this has been a lot of fun, and I was pretty sure we were going to finish the parak today. I'm not so sure anymore. In Pasuk Bet, it says, "V'chol avdei hamelech asher b'shar hamelech korim u'mishtachavim lahaman," and all of the servants of the king who are in the gate of the king are bowing. Now, korim u'mishtachavim is two levels, right? You bow and you prostrate yourself completely to Haman. Now, who would sit in the Shar HaMelech? The people who sit in the Shar HaMelech in the gates of the king are officials. That was an official space of the government. So he says, the Ibn Ezra says, this is Nusach Bet in Ibn Ezra, he says these are all the Shoftim, all of the important officials are Korim u'mishtachavim to Haman. But Rabbi Yehuda Nachmiash, one of the Rishonim, says, wait a second, Korim u'mishtachavim is a terminology that's used in worship. It's not just korim. and not just mishtachavim, the two of them together. We say v'anachnu korim u'mishtachavim lifnei melech malchei melachim hakadosh baruch hu and aleinu. Those two together imply some level of religious service, which enables all of us to say, hey, this bowing to Haman was much more than just you bow to the king or bow to an important official. I'm able to bow to an important official. If an important official walks in, you bow. That's just normal kavod. It's nothing nefarious about it. But here, korim u'mishtachavim implies immediately that there's some level of avodah zarah, which leads us to the famous medrash, which is found in Pirkei de Rebbe Eliezer, Perek Nun, and it's also quoted in the Ibn Ezra, Nusach Aleph, and also in Esther Rabbah, Zion Hay, that Haman had hanging around his neck an idol. Okay, and what he was trying to do was, this was part of his nefarious plan. He wanted everybody, when he walked by, to accept this idolatry. Now, the problem is with this, is there's another medrash. Another medrash says that all of the members of the Sanhedrin were sitting in this Shar HaMelech. They were also officials. It wasn't just Mordechai Hayudi who was Shar HaMelech. There were other important Jews who were in the Shar HaMelech, and they bowed down. And it's impossible for us to imagine that they would bow down if there was really this idol around his neck or on his clothing. That's the two different versions. And so Rebbe Vigdor Kohen Tzedek, again, another Rishon on the Megillat Esther, says, no, this wasn't, he didn't have an idolatry hanging around his neck, because it's impossible. But rather it was some kind of symbol that Haman made in honor of the king. It was maybe even a picture of the king. Okay, it was something he had. Yeah, Barry. Oh, we'll get to the Chichein Tzivalo HaMelech.
It says right there.
No, interestingly, okay, that Chichein Tzivalo HaMelech, that ultimately, thank you, Esther, that ultimately what it says, that the king commanded him, right? Tzivalo HaMelech. So when it says, according to the Chachmei Tzarfat, to the Rishonim from France, they said Tziva lo HaMelech is that it was Tziva bishvilo. He did it in honor of the king. It disagrees with the translation you have, Tziva lo HaMelech, or the Vilna Gaon actually says that Tziva lo HaMelech there was this blanket permission that the king had given to him, do whatever you want to do. And he was able to do such a thing because no one else had people bowing down to him to such an extent. And what you end up having here is this tension about the pasuk. The one side says it was an avodah zarah. Avodah zarah makes it real easy. Why did Mordechai bow down to him? He didn't want to bow down to the avodah zarah. We'll see that in a minute. Number two is, no, this was just an added measure of respect that Haman was demanding for himself, and Mordechai didn't want to give it to him. Okay, both of them are understandable. Now, Kichein Tziva lo HaMelech, that ultimately, you're right in terms of the pshat, it was commanded by the king, it would sound like, right? The problem here is, we don't see that command coming from the king. No, we don't see the command coming from the king. And this idea of bowing down to Haman, why was that necessary? Now, I can go back, Barry, before you jump. I can go back and I can say, wait a second, let's go back to what Rabbi Bachrach had said, Yoshua Bachrach. He had said that basically Achashverosh had put Haman in his stead. Very similar to Paro doing with Yosef in Egypt. You're the person in front. Okay, now if you're the person in front, then you get the same kind of honor like the king gets. Okay, this is all part of that order that the king had given. I want you to be my number two. Okay, that works. Okay, I want you to do it. I want you to do this. It doesn't say anywhere in the pasuk anything was hanging around his neck, right? So the command was from the king, people, Haman is my top person. You got to give him coffee. He's my top person. And Haman and everybody else is bowing down to Haman. That's the pshat. Okay? And Mordechai refuses. Now, the problem I have with that is, why would Mordechai refuse? Why would Mordechai refuse that?
He's a Jew, doesn't bow down to other Jews.
First of all, Haman's not a Jew, right?
No, but he doesn't bow down.
Oh yeah, excuse me, Barry, you'll excuse me. If you went ahead and you were in line to meet Queen Elizabeth, okay, you would bow down to Queen Elizabeth. Okay. Oh, Korim Mishtach Chavim, it's a little bit more. Okay, but you would bow down to Queen Elizabeth, right? I would bow down to Queen Elizabeth. Listen, one of my favorite experiences that I'll never forget was many, many years ago. George Bush, the Tate, okay, was running as vice president for Reagan. And there was, some of you may remember, there was a political rally that took place at Ida Crown. And Bush came. And before he came and spoke to the room full, it was a rainy day, it was supposed to be outside. Before he came to speak to the room full of people in the gym, it was packed. Okay, he first came to meet with the rabbis, and we were sitting in the room that was called the Gray Library. It was a conference room that maybe 20% bigger than this room. And that room was packed with rabbis, okay? And there was a strict protocol, who was allowed to ask a question, not ask a question. Okay, and we're all sitting there and we're waiting, and everybody's excited to meet the Vice President of the United States. The Vice President of the United States walks in and everyone jumps to attention. No one had to tell him to jump to attention. Everyone jumped to attention, and they stood until he sat down, and everyone sat down. Okay, it was no question about it. This wasn't a great Rosh Hashiva who walked in. This was the Vice President of the United States. It was pretty impressive. That's the protocol. You don't bow to the president or the vice president, okay? But you do snap to a certain amount of attention. And the same thing happens when the president walks into a room, you stand up for the president. And if you're meeting a king or a queen, you bow. And Jews did that. So the question is, why would Mordechai refuse that? Now, we'll see in a minute one great answer to it. And we're definitely not going to finish this parak today. But there is the easy answer, that it was a more nefarious kind of peace. It wasn't just a political battle, but rather Haman was seeking the neshama of the Jewish people. He was seeking to destroy the neshama avodah zarah. Boom. Okay, and in which case you're right. I have the challenge of how to explain Kichein Tziva Lo HaMelech. So the Vilna Gaon has his explanation of Chachmei Tzarfat, but you have to change it a little bit because you don't see Achashverosh getting into religion. Yeah.
Okay, maybe I'm hanging a little too much on the English.
Okay.
But I do get the Hebrew a bit. Why do we take something that's so clear and unclear it?
Okay, so the question...
It says, again, I'll stick with the English for the moment. It says the king told him to do it. Now, that's pretty clear in English.
Good, but
and in Hebrew, I don't think it's all that different.
Okay, but the problem is that the next phrase, Mordechai lo yichrav lo yishtechav, and Mordechai refused to do this. So the problem we have to try to figure out is, why would Mordechai refuse normal protocol? If it was just normal protocol, why would he refuse to do so? Okay, now, so you have to, then you start having to say there must be more to the story. That's where the Medrash pops in. He's not, you know what, you don't make a, Vice President Bush was not Ronald Reagan, okay? You still give those kind of honor to him.
I have an observation going back to his elevation coming out of like left field that gives rise to the Medrash that says that Memuchan was there from before, and he was the one who had set this whole thing up. There's the Ketziv and Kri of the name Memuchan back in the first parak, where it's the Ketziv is Mumkan, but we pronounce it Memuchan. Not only that,
excuse me. So first of all, Memuchan, there is a medrash which says he was Haman. There's also difficulties with saying, which we dealt with. But in addition to it, your point is correct. It seems to be unusual, and this is what enables a medrash to do this, because all of a sudden, where does Haman come from? Okay, to put somebody as your number two, there's no backstory to it. So we're trying to find the backstory, and Memuchan had been the one who had given him the advice. Okay,
not only that, but he was the one who he changed the Divrei Hayamim in the Chronicles, or at least one copy of the Chronicles, to say that he was the one.
You don't find that, excuse me, now you're throwing medrash on top of medrash. There's no basis of that in the text. No basis of that.
Except,
no basis.
No.
There's no basis in the text. That's a medrash. Yafa.
Why can't we just keep it simple and say that when you trace your lineage all the way back to the Agagite king, Agag, just say it. If you went all those generations and say, I come from Agag, you are set up to say, I am someone special. And you've set up who you are. That is to say, I'm Agag, noted enemy of the people. When Achashverosh elevates him, this sets him up as a potential seeker of replacing him. A king, a descendant of a king seeking to displace the king. It would work perfectly with the plot to make him paranoid later in the game. Right now, he's looking for somebody to be on his side. But the fact that he can be traced to Agag at such a late date means that somehow he carried that tradition in his family, that he is a descendant of someone special, a king, and I have royal blood. Hence, Mordechai knows that because Haman is publicizing it. I won't bow to you.
So, but again, not bowing to him. So you're suggesting the reason he doesn't bow to him is because he is an Amaleki. Okay. Now it could be
not really an Amaleki, an Agagite king.
Okay, a king. That he's the descendant of a king and he's royal. Okay, but Mordechai doesn't bow down to him. But the question still is, that's a pretty big step to take. It's a pretty big step because what you're doing is you're insulting him, and you're insulting him in among other royal appointees in the Shar HaMelech. You're appointing, those are, let's assume for a moment, the others are loyalists of the king. You're risking a lot on this. And so as a result, why would he do this? So again, if I say it's Avodah Zarah, Mordechai has no choice. Avodah Zarah, pagan worship is one of those, the big three. You don't violate it and we're done. And so it's like Mordechai's hands were tied. He would have loved to have violated it. Because why take all the risks? If I say it was something else, it gets really, really complicated on how to understand it. So for instance, the Ibn Ezra says on this, that the reason he did it is because he was stuck. You know, there are times where at least I know, there are times I know I'm in situations where I'm going to find myself in the middle of a machloket. Something's happening in shul. I see something off in the corner at Kiddush. And I go ahead and I have two choices at that moment. I walk to the problem. Okay, that's when I make my biggest mistakes. Or I decide, I got someplace to go right now and I better get my coat on. Okay. Yeah. Now, Mordechai, in this case, no matter what it is, let's say it's Avodah Zarah. He feels he has no choice, which is the classic approach of Chazal. He has absolutely no choice. Why didn't he walk away? So the Ibn Ezra says he couldn't walk away because Mordechai, while he was an official in the Shar HaMelech, he had to stay in the Shar HaMelech. He had to be there. His attendance was mandatory. It wasn't an optional. He didn't have personal days off. And so as a result, he had absolutely no choice. And then since he had no choice to leave, he also had no choice but to stand straight and not to bow. That solves that piece. But, and this is what I had sent out, and I have a few copies here as well, just to hand out for those who are here in person, and I will bring it on the screen for everyone else. Yoshua Bachrach builds it up very, very beautifully, and I'm not sure why I can't share this. If you give me one moment. Hold on, I'm sorry. It's going to take me another moment just to get this going. If
wait, while you're doing that, if that's the case, then yes. How did the rest of the Sanhedrin bow down?
So that's why Avigdor Cohen Tzedek says it wasn't Avodah Zarah.
No, I understand, but you're saying if if we're saying that that's why he couldn't bow down, Mordechai, what happened to everyone else?
Okay, so you're right. And so again, we have, in other words, there's this tension. There are two explanations of what Haman was doing. Explanation number one was some measure of glory, of protocol, of kavod. Okay, you give to the person who's the number two in the government. That's one. That one, why Mordechai wouldn't do it, I'll get to in a second. And unfortunately, I can't bring up on screen, so you're just going to have to listen to me read it from Bachrach, or if you can pull it up, I sent it out this morning. The other possibility is it's Avodah Zarah, and Mordechai, and if it's Avodah Zarah, Mordechai didn't have a choice, but now I have that problem of the Sanhedrin. Well, I can say that medrash is not a medrash I accept, because nowhere do we see other members of the Sanhedrin and the Shar HaMelech. There are different paths that we go on this explanation. So I can't, if it's Avodah Zarah, I can't accept that the members of the Sanhedrin were there and bowing. If it wasn't Avodah Zarah, I can accept them bowing. And I'm running these two parallel tracks, and I really don't know for sure. But watch what Bachrach does. And it's on page 70. On the right side, I have an arrow leading to it. I'm going to read it for those who don't have it available to them. Mordechai Migdolei Adoraya, he was one of the great of his generation. He understood that God wasn't knocking at his door with this shocking or type of stringencies on him. And especially when regarding this righteous woman who didn't have a father and a mother, in other words, Esther, who was being cared for by him, that she should be defiled by this uncircumcised, evil person, Achashverosh. Mordechai understood something's going on here, that Esther should be taken. Mordechai Mordechai saw something's happening there's something happening from heavens, and he felt, he just didn't know what. So Mordechai was going back and forth in front of the women's harem, to see how she was. And what will happen to her? And during that time, all of the bitterness of their exile was pounding at him. She koveshet et amo v'gozelet mimeno et banav et benotav letam'am begoyim, which is stealing their offspring to assimilate into the nations. He's listening to this curse from the Tochacha that your children are going to be given to another nation. Mordechai was in pain for many days. He wanted to know what's the great thing that's going to happen, and how's it all going to come about. In other words, Mordechai knew when Esther was taken that something bigger is happening behind all this. And it was hurting him just to watch what was happening all around him. Those days were very difficult because nothing happened. And he's hearing the quiet screams of cries of Esther from where she was held. And he sees it and he can't do anything about it. And then all of a sudden something happens. He comes upon the coup of Bigtan and Teresh, and he became aware of it. But he goes ahead, he figures this is what's going to happen, but the whole thing just passes and nothing changes in his status. He didn't even get anything when he saved the king from being killed. Nothing happened for him. And then on top of it, here comes this evil thing. And it caused pain on top of his pain. All of a sudden, Haman comes on the scene. He's in this agony over what happened to Esther. He knows there must be something bigger that's supposed to happen, can't figure it out. Then Bigtan Teresh, she's convinced, oh, now I'm going to be able to change the date. Nothing happens. And then what happens? Haman. Is he going to bow down to him? Lo. There's no chance that he's going to bow down to this person. Here, all of a sudden, this anger that's been stored up in him comes up. He sees that the command to bow down is something that's to him. It was directed to him. And therefore, he uses the same passive ammunition that he had given to Esther. And Esther never said who she was. Mordechai wouldn't bow down. Zam HaMekupach balo leMordechai matkonet shivto tchunat shivto hayimini. And this anger, this rage came from his shevet. Asher lamud haya lishtok. It was a shevet that knew how to keep quiet. Ulatzo yamim rabim et tzaro et al kipuchav ad et bo dvaro. And he knew how to keep the pain inside until something had to occur. Imam Rachel. Mordechai is a descendant of Rachel. Asher nasayamim rabim et elbon kipucha asher kipchat avi arami min achalat Yaakov hayudala v'avi hatelba ve'chlif et achupata v'natna leLeah. Think of all of the things that happened to Rachel. She ultimately had to bear this great pain of the person who was destined to be with her. From Yaakov, she couldn't marry him right away, then switched Rachel. All of this she kept inside. And she had to deal with her father, Lavan. And what did she do? She stole his idols. She wanted to uproot all of this idea of Avodah Zarah. And therefore, what she wanted to do was she had taken an action. The action Rachel took ultimately was to try to stop Avodah Zarah. She tried to take it. Now here comes Mordechai. Mordechai is an offspring of Rachel. Mordechai has the same thing, the ability to wait, to bear this burden, the shame and the pain, but then when the time comes to act, he's able to act. Mordechai, what does he do? Rachel took the idols from her father's house to try to stop that kind of Avodah Zarah. Mordechai, he acts and he tries to stop now what Haman is trying to do. Mordechai has this built up as well. Mordechai makes this the moment. He sees this as his defining moment in history. He knew there's something that has to happen. Shoshi.
Okay. First of all, he is not being passive. By not bowing down, that is not being passive.
No, up until that moment, he had not done anything.
Right. Then he listen.
And you think about it for a minute. This has been 5 years in the making.
Okay. But
5 years, he's going back and forth. Right.
His not bowing down, that was a very active act. That wasn't a passive.
Interestingly, not doing something is passive resistance. We can talk to my buddy Mahatma Gandhi. Okay, it's a passive resistance. It's not active. Now it's true. It's a very strong piece. Okay, it's noticeable, but he didn't do something. But he saw that the need to not do something was necessary.
And what happened to Rachel by not saying anything? Ultimately, she died because of it, right? So had she said, oh, P.S., I took those idols because you know what, Dad? You shouldn't have idols anymore. Done.
We don't know. We don't know.
Well.
So unfortunately, we don't know what the alternative could have been with Rachel if she had admitted it or not. We do know what she did. Her battle was against Avodah Zarah. Now, let's go back to these two pieces. And we've gotten very far. We've gotten two psukim today. The second pasuk ultimately places before us the following basic issue. Haman is now the number 2 in the monarchy. Mordechai is taking him on. Why he takes him on, we have 2 different possibilities, but ultimately we know he's taking him on. And at that point, what's even more interesting, Vayomru avdei hamelech, we're going to get Pasuk Gimel in today. Vayomru avdei hamelech asher b'shar hamelech leMordechai, madua ta over mitzvat hamelech. Haman doesn't react immediately. The other people who were there, they're the ones who go to Mordechai and they say, why? Why are you doing this? They saw that Mordechai was being different and they couldn't understand it. Vayehi be'omram or ki'omram. Okay, there's a Korean tiv here. When he said, or if he said, when he did this, what did he say to them? Vayehi ki'omram elav yom v'yom v'lo shama lehem. And this went every single day. He didn't listen to them. Now, what did they told him? What did they tell him?
Why don't you bow down?
Why aren't you bowing down? It's an understood piece. He didn't listen to them. Now, interestingly, we have this Yom Yom. Where else do we find Yom Yom? If you remember a few weeks back, and I gave you a sheet of paper, Yafa.
Potiphar and the Ashes Potiphar and Yosef.
Eshet Potiphar and Yosef, Vayhi Dabra El Yosef Yom Yom Velo Shama Eleha. Very, very similar. Each and every day she was trying to seduce Yosef and he didn't listen to her. Here there is a comparison. Why? What's the comparison? What's the comparison between the two? If you remember, when it came to Yosef, Chazal talk about this very powerful imagery of the Diukno Shel Aviv, that Yosef always had before his eyes the image of his father. And that kept him and transformed him to Yosef HaTzadik. He had those role models. Now, Shoshi, as the therapist among us, will talk about how important it is for parents to provide that role modeling for children, that children can, when they don't know what to do, even if the parent is not around, they can see their parent before them. Here, Mordechai, the same set of words are there. Mordechai understands who he is. And by understanding who he is, he sees the image of whichever ancestors were before him, and he refuses to do it. This is something that we view as very, very positive. Vayagidu lahaman lirot ha'yamdu divrei Mordechai ki higid lahem asher hu Yehudi. And so what did these people do? They told Haman, they told on Mordechai, and they ratted him out. Haman didn't immediately notice this. So it's interesting. Why wouldn't he have noticed it? You know, it could be there were a lot of people there. And one person doesn't bow down. You may not notice it right away. But he didn't. But the people saw this. And what he wanted to do, Hayamdu divrei Mordechai. Hayamdu is an interesting verb form. And they wanted to see if this was going to continue forever. Will this be something? And why? Ki higid lahem asher hu Yehudi. Mordechai told him he was a Jew. Where did Mordechai tell him he was a Jew? Mordechai said, "V'lo shama alehem." He didn't listen to them. It must have been, in other words, it must have been at some point that he finally gave in and explained to them that I can't do this. I'm a Jew. I can't bow down to him. And as a result, they did it. And what happens when they did it? Vayar Haman ki ein Mordechai koreh mishtachavelo. Then Haman sees it. Okay, he's been told, keep an eye out, watch him. This happens lahavdil to everyone. And sometimes somebody's doing something, you don't notice it. And then finally, and someone says, do you see what that person's doing? And then you notice it. Teachers in classrooms, this happens too many times. One of the other kids says, the kid every day is playing his whatever he's playing. And finally, you begin to notice it. Vayimaleh Haman chima. And Haman became infuriated. He was angry. Chema, says Ramosha Chalav, ultimately that because anger warms up the body, heats up the body. Okay, if someone is really angry, they turn all red. Their blood, we use all these words in English. Their blood begins to boil. Blood is not boiling. Okay, but they became angry and they became hot. And all of this happens when he sees it. Now, interestingly, you're the number 2 to the king. What should you be able to do?
Off with his head.
Off with his head, kill him right on the spot. Why couldn't he kill him right on the spot?
Isn't there, Rabbi Matanki, isn't there a protocol of tolerance in the kingdom of Persia? Everybody's supposed to be able to practice their religion nicely. It's like, this is like the woke thing. This is, don't make trouble. But at the same time, if you don't bow to the king and observe that kind of protocol or his representative, it's like the police turning their back on the king, on the mayor.
So you're 100% right that the tradition, and this goes back to the Babylonian tradition, that they allowed people to maintain certain elements of autonomy within the various provinces which they've been resettled into. And the Jews were allowed to worship God. So you're right. Haman had a problem. If this is a question of Avodah Zarah, it's not so simple that you can force the person to bow down to it because he's got his own gods. You have to go ahead and do exactly what Haman is going to do later on and say, they don't worship the way we worship. They're actually seditious in nature, which is what's going to come up in the chapter. If you can say that the Jews and their God are acts of sedition, that this is going to cause a rebellion, then it's a different thing. There's a limit to how tolerant I can be. That's one. But if I take that approach that this was all just honor and protocol, again, remember, this supports the idea that Mordechai was somebody important. To go ahead and on the spot kill an important official is not so simple. And Rav Bachrach goes a step further, and that is that Haman knew that Mordechai had been recorded in the book of the king. And when he knew he was recorded in the book of the king, he knew that if at some point at a later date, the king would hear that Haman had killed this person who had saved the life of the king, that he might be in trouble also. So he knew if he wanted to get rid of Mordechai, he had to do it in a smart way. He couldn't do it immediately at the spot. So as a result, what happens? Vayivez beinav lishloach yad b'Mordechai levato. Haman didn't just want to go ahead and kill Mordechai. Ki higidu lo et am Mordechai. They told him he was from the Jewish people. Ve'vakesh Haman lashmid et kol hayudim asher b'chol malchut Achshverosh am Mordechai. And so therefore he decided that he needed to kill them all. Now, according to the Malbim, this is a pretty big jump, by the way. There's one guy, and now I'm going to kill everybody who's like him. But according to the Malbim, if the reason was, as we say before, that Mordechai Asher hu Yehudi, that Mordechai was a Jew, and that's why he won't extend this honor to Haman, well, at that point, he's a representative of the Jews, and all the Jews won't do it, and Haman feels he'll never be able to get what he wants to do. That's the Malbim's approach. The fact that he's identified as a Jew. Now, on the other hand, if I say that the Jews are viewed by Haman as a despicable people, as someone not worth even the time of day, in that kind of case, Ramosha Chalava says that that's why he was willing to kill them all. Because to Haman, according to that approach, it's no difference. You kill one Jew, you kill 100,000 Jews. They're all the same. Lahavdil, we saw this, in Germany during World War II. One person does something wrong and they shoot everybody who's around. So it's the same kind of peace that you could possibly have in both. We have as a result, the beginning of this piece. It is, by the way, and I can go back, if I say representative of the Jews, and if Agag is really Amalek, okay, this is the beginning of the battle again between the Jews and Amalek, which started from the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim, the one nation who was willing to take us on in a way that diminished us among all the peoples of the world. That's Amalek. As Rashi quotes the Medrash, that Amalek were the ones who jumped into the hot tub and cooled it off. When the Jews came out of Egypt, they were on top of the world. No one wanted to get near them. No one wanted to touch them. They saw that God protected them. Amalek said, look, they can die. And as a result, from that point on, people were able to attack Jews and kill Jews. Amalek has this hatred for the Jewish people. That's what makes them unique. That's why maybe Haman would want to kill all of the Jews. Yeah.
Did Mordecai prostrate himself to the king?
We don't see yet that connection, but we'll see that later on, that it would probably be the case. Okay, we're going to stop right here because the time is up right here. Next week, we will finish the parak. For those who are new in the shir, and there's a couple of new people, please don't think that we only do 3 or 4 psukim a week. We normally do a lot more, but sometimes the psukim are a lot of fun. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Rabbi, how was